Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here for my Friday reads as usual. And today I'm going to start off by showing you my beautiful new teacup. I finally broke down and bought it. I told myself I wouldn't, but then I decided that I would. It's this beautiful green-blue color. It's called Autumn Poppy. That's the pattern on here. And the saucer is actually wood of all things, which I've never seen. And I had been seeing this cup in the bookshop since late July, early August, I think. And I'd passed it by many times. And last weekend I finally decided I was going to get it, and I'm quite pleased with my purchase here. And if you're wondering, I've got Lady Grey from Twinings or Twinings. I'm never quite sure how it's pronounced. I've always pronounced it Twinings just because that's how I decided I was going to pronounce it when I first started drinking the tea as a teenager, but I think it might actually be Twinings. As you can tell, I'm a tea expert. And despite my love of tea, I mostly do just drink bagged teas because I am extremely lazy and I am extremely economical. And so I just prefer the bagged teas. I know I could go the loose leaf route, but when you put all that loose leaf tea in a little strainer and it makes a mess, and then you have to clean the strainer and the tea leaves won't come out, and then you've got tea leaves all in your sink. I'm just really lazy, but enough defending my tea choices. It was a little bit of a slow reading week for me. I did read Autopsy of a Boring Wife last weekend, and I uploaded a quick sort of impromptu review for that book immediately after I finished it. So if you're interested in that, you can go and check that out. But I'm not really in the mood to talk about that book again, so I'm just going to talk about what I've been reading since then. And this is a book that I showed in my last Friday reads, and as you can see, I didn't make much progress. I am still only 145 pages in, but the reading I have done, I have immensely enjoyed. I feel like I've stumbled across a hidden treasure. So this is La Reginata by Leopoldo Alas, a Spanish author who I had never heard of until I bought this. And I believe this was his only full-length published novel. It was published originally in 1885, and it was criticized for its obscene irreligiosity, stumbling a bit, for its obscene irreligiosity, and for being a plagiarism of Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Now, 145 pages in, I can see how, a similar plot line as Madame Bovary is emerging. We have the married woman who is perhaps disenchanted and bored with her married life, who has spent too much time, in air quotes there, reading and indulging in romantic literature, and even writing her own poetry, her own romantic religious poetry. She has spent too much time doing this, and so it causes her to, act out and have dreams beyond her home life, and I can see that she's probably headed towards an affair with one of the men that we've seen in this novel. And so in that sense, it is like Madame Bovary, because Madame Bovary is about a young woman who marries, who is disenchanted with married life, bored with her husband, who reads a lot of books, and ends up having an affair, which is her ruin. But this novel has, I'm going to say, a lot more depth than Madame Bovary. It's a much more well built out world. Not that I don't love Madame Bovary. Madame Bovary is just a different novel. This novel actually opens in a church, in a cathedral, and we see the various religious men and their perhaps very unpious, very unmoral thoughts. They judge people. We've got this one religious man up in the bell tower, and he's got a spyglass, and he is essentially looking out over his city. Let me just remember the name of the town here. I'm thinking it's Ventura. Vetusta. It's the city of Vetusta where this novel takes place. And it opens in this cathedral, in this church. The church is described as Gothic style. The tower is a romantic poem in stone, a delicate hymn with its gentle lines of silent eternal beauty. A 16th century work, although begun earlier. And so we have this, this beautiful church, this impressive city, and we've got, I don't know whether they're priests or monks, I'm not quite sure of the Spanish vocabulary that's being used here. They're just referred to as Don. So we have Don Saturnino. They do appear to be Catholic. And you'll have to forgive me for not having the characters straight, but there are so many of them at this point. So we open in this church, and then we see the judge's wife come in for confession, and they're a little bit flustered because the head priest, I'd call him, is not available to take her confession because he didn't realize she was coming that day, and it's usually his day off. But of course she leaves when she finds out that he's not there, and so to everyone else, to all the gossips, it looks as though she's been snubbed. And so the head priest and another priest, run off to the plaza where she is browsing with some friends of hers and, apologize for not being there to take her confession. And that is how we meet Anna. That is how we meet Anita, the judge's wife. And she is, a very interesting character. As I said, she likes to read. She is a writer, a poet herself. And we learn a little bit about her childhood. There is this very, funny story of her and her journey to religion and her, missteps in her childhood. So she was born to a seamstress and her wealthy father, who was a nobleman, and her mother died in childbirth, and so off she went with her father. Now her father had been ostracized from society a bit for marrying beneath him and for also adopting these very atheist views, which of course sets him outside of society. And he's got this library with all these books, and his young daughter, who he is raising as an atheist, is raised in part by a tutor, by a governess. And the governess absolutely despises her. In fact, the governess has designs on marrying her father. Her father doesn't give her the time of day, and so she lashes out at the child, at Anna, and treats her rather poorly. And Anna is absolutely the picture of innocence. In fact, there is a little bit of a scandal when she spends the night, when she's 11 years old, she spends the night in a small boat with a boy. And the governess spreads, this tale far and wide and says, "I cannot work for you anymore, you must take your daughter back." And so off she goes to her father, and of course the father and the old maid aunts have both been given the impression that she did something immoral while in this boat. That she perhaps was seduced or had sex with this young boy who is 11 or 12 himself. But Anna is still the picture of innocence and has no idea why everybody is so upset. And so she gets off to a bit of a rocky start, but we find out that it was romantic notions of adventure that led her to want to stay the night in this boat, to want to go off with this boy at all. She had these romantic stories in her head of, battles and grand adventures with this boy, and of course she didn't tell him any of these stories. We don't know why she didn't share her imagination, but we see very early on that, this is her downfall, her imagination, her romantic imaginings. And when she is a teenager, a young woman, she reads a few religious works. She reads St. Augustine, and St. Augustine is actually what brings her to tears and brings her into the religious life. And she becomes so enraptured with these religious writings that she wants to write her own. She wants to write something equally as moving, and so she begins to write religious poetry. Of course, when her old maid aunts find this religious poetry, they are scandalized that she is writing these romantic poems, because poetry is no pastime for a proper young woman. And in fact, it's funny, the aunts keep using this phrase, they are people of quality, they only associate with people of quality, and their niece must be a person of quality. And of course, their main goal is to make a success of her. They've taken her in out of the goodness of their heart, so to speak. You can tell it's got a lot to do with their egos, and they want to marry her off to a wealthy man. Now they realize that since she has no fortune of her own, her father squandered the fortune. Since she has no fortune of her own, she's probably not going to marry someone with noble birth. But that aside, so the aunts are setting her up for marriage, and she is quite excited at the prospect of falling in love, but once again, her romantic notions are perhaps getting in the way here. And so I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to summarize too much because that will spoil a bit of the novel for you, but it is just a really delightful novel to read, and the writing has such depth and detail to it. And the writing style too is quite biting, it's quite funny. We have another entire, corner of the novel that's going on, so to speak, with this gentleman's club. And it's a minor plot point, but I want to read you a scene from this because I found it funny. Funny for us bibliophiles. So it's this gentleman's club, and they have different game rooms, but they also have a library. And so we meet a bibliophile on page 129 here. So it's described that in this reading room, most people don't actually read. Some people sit down with newspapers because they think it makes them look intelligent, and there's all this, biting, sarcastic commentary on the different gentlemen who come to this reading room. But there is one cabinet with some very old books inside, and the keys are missing. But we discover here on page 129 that the keys are missing because someone has stolen the keys. And so Leopoldo Alas writes here, by 11 o'clock at night, no one was left in the reading room. The porter, half asleep, would fold up the newspapers, turn down the gas, and leave the room in almost complete darkness, going back to his own quarters to sleep. Now was the time for the arrival of Don Amadeo Bedoya, a captain in the artillery in civilian dress, muffled in a broad-caped box coat. He looked all around. There was nobody there, and the darkness was his ally. With supreme caution, he approached the bookcase. From his pocket, he took a key. He opened the bottom drawer, picked up a book, put in its place another book hidden under his cape, tucked the first book into the folds of his box coat, and locked the drawer. After taking a deep breath, he approached the table, whistled the national anthem, and pretended to glance through the newspapers. He, bothering with newspapers, To keep up pretenses, he stayed there for 5 minutes, and then departed in triumph. He was not a thief, he was a bibliophile. Bedoya's key was the one which had been lost by the porter. Don Amadio and Don Saturnino Bermudez, you'll have to excuse me for butchering these names, of the military. He had once been a valiant soldier, but then he had had the honor of being elected president of an infantry Athenaeum. That's a new word. I don't know what that means. I'll have to look that up. Athenaeum. And had been obliged to prepare and pronounce a speech, finding to his great surprise that he was an excellent orator in his own opinion and in that of his superiors. One thing led to another. He had ended up as a man of letters, to the extent of solemnly swearing to himself with all the vigor that is so becoming in defenders of the fatherland, to become a scholar. Vetustins had begun to take notice of the military man, who knew more about letters than many civilians, and Bedoya himself, amused by what he regarded as a contrast between artillery and literature, had warmed to the task. In time he had become either a corresponding or full member of many scientific, artistic, and literary societies. He excelled at history and botany, especially the latter in its relationships with horticulture. He was a specialist in the diseases of the potato, and had produced a treatise on the subject which had somehow not yet been awarded a government prize. He also had a gift for military biography. He knew of various lieutenant generals who had been verifiable Farneses or Spinolas, without the world suspecting it, and had brought to light the life of a certain brigadier who, not having been in command of the action on a certain field, would, if he had been, have conquered the glory of a Napoleon instead of losing his positions as the inept general had done. The sources for this kind of biography, of people who could have been important, were to be found in books such as those in the bottom drawer of the bookcase in the club. There must have been other copies around the world, but nobody knew of them, and Bedoya belonged to that class of scholars who find merit in reproducing what no one else had seen fit to read. As soon as he sat down upon his own paper, the paragraphs which he copied in the neat, graceful copperplate hand that God had given him, he considered them all to be his own work. But antiques were his forte. An object to art had no merit in his eyes, even though it dated from the time of Noah, unless it was his, whereas Bermudez loved antiquity for itself. He needed the cherished object to belong to him. So we get this very interesting picture of Bedoya, of this man who frequents this gentleman's club, this private club, and he is not only stealing books because he is a bibliophile, because he has to have them, but he is stealing them because they are rare, because they are perhaps one of a kind, and he is plagiarizing these works as his own, and making his fame and making his fortune and reputation. And this book is full of little nuggets like that, little bits that make me smile and make me, think about how corrupt the society and the people portrayed in this novel are. So I am definitely interested in reading on with this. So let me know what you've been reading this week, what you're planning to read this week, and what your favorite kind of tea is.